So I had my Starbucks today. It was a small one. It's still getting into my system. And actually right now I'm a Jehovah's Witness, but it ought to be adequate for my task today. I don't know if you ever thought about this, but there are actually a lot of ways to prove that Christianity is false. You probably didn't expect a guy like me to say that, but think about it. Our story starts in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. If there's no God, there's no story, right? We believe in Jesus, but if Jesus never existed or he wasn't the kind of individual that we find in the scriptures, well, then we're out of luck again, all right? If there's no soul, which a lot of people believe we're just meat all the way down, well, then there's nothing that survives the death of the body, right? So there's no me that survives to go to heaven or to hell. Paul said, if Jesus hasn't risen bodily from the grave, not only is our view false, but people ought to feel sorry for us. That's in 1 Corinthians 15. So there are a lot of ways, in principle at least, I don't think any of those ways go through, but there are a lot of ways in principle to demonstrate that Christianity is false. It's a falsifiable religious view. I want to talk this morning about another way to deep six Christianity that maybe you haven't considered to be in that category. And it's a view that is widely accepted, at least on one level, and I'll make that distinction in a little bit. But on one level, a lot of people hold this to be the case, this issue I want to talk about, and consequently, they don't take Christianity seriously at all. And let me introduce the topic by telling you about a really stunning conversation I had with a young lady in a chiropractor's office. I've had back problems for years and years and years. And so many years ago, I was in the chiropractor's office, which you should call it chiropractor, I think, in my view. But and I was getting prepped, right? And so she's putting all the stuff together, and I'm laid down there, whatever. She's setting things up for the chiropractor proper. And so I decided to ask her a question. I said, I've been reading some books on ethics, and I'm curious about your point of view about something. She said, okay. I said, do you think morality is objective or subjective in some sense? She said, what do you mean by morality? Not a good start. I said, okay, what's right and what's wrong, ethically speaking, what's right? And so I'm going back and forth with her, and she's having a hard time grasping the concept. And so I thought, well, I'll give her like a clear case example. And I said, what about murder? Killing a person with no good reason. Is that wrong? Well, I said, well, what? She said, well, I'm thinking. And I'm thinking, what's to think about, right? And finally she said, well, I think it's, it's up to the individual. So I thought, okay, this was not a clear case example. Clear case examples are supposed to be easy, like who's buried in Grant's tomb? How long was the 100 Years' War? Which actually wasn't 100 years long, as I recall. Or what's the number to 911? Do they still use 911? I don't even know if that's usable anymore. But so this is the easy one. So that wasn't easy enough. So I said, is it okay to torture babies for fun? Well, and then she says this, I wouldn't want anyone to do that to my baby. Now, I want you to think about the response. Of course, anybody would say that. I wouldn't want them to do that to my baby. But I wasn't asking her about what she would personally desire. I was asking whether the action itself was wrong, regardless of whether anybody wanted anyone else to do that to anyone. Long pause. Finally, she said, I think people should be allowed to decide for themselves. Now, this is not the first time that I've asked the question about torturing babies for fun, and I've gotten an equivocal response. I was on KFI in Los Angeles once, the big secular talk jock station. It goes all the way to actually at night it'll go all the way to the Mississippi River. It's that powerful. And I was interviewed there, and I got the same response from the host. What's going on here? I'll tell you what's going on. It's the power of an idea. And that idea we touched on a little bit yesterday. It's called relativism. But today I want to talk about it with regard specifically to the area of morality. Now, I talked yesterday, and we'll just do a little review, about the difference between relativism or subjectivism, or what I called ice cream kind of truth. Remember that? I think a bunch of people went out and had ice cream for dessert last night because I, fired up all those carnal desires. And insulin kind of truth. So an ice cream kind of truth is something that is true for the individual, okay? True for me. And ice cream kinds of truths are neither right nor wrong. And what I mean is they're neither correct nor incorrect is what I mean, all right? Then when it comes to insulin kind of truths, these are truths pertaining to not something inside the person, their own feelings and desires and tastes and mere convictions, but something that is true in virtue of something outside of the person, okay? Like some kind of disease that requires a particular kind of medicine, whether you agree or believe in it or not. So that's insulin kind of truth. So this inside-outside distinction is maybe the easiest way to distinguish between subjective truth and objective truth, or subjective truth is often called relativism, okay? That is, the truth is relative to the individual, all right? If you want a little more philosophical, hoity-toity way of thinking of it, relativistic truth is mind-dependent, and objective truth is mind-independent. So when it comes to morality, that which is ethically right or wrong, okay? Relativism says that morality is just a matter of individual choice, belief, preference. It's an ice cream kind of thing. And so if you have one understanding of what's right or wrong on a particular issue, famously abortion or premarital sex or other kinds of sexual variations, well, that's your view. You're welcome to your view. Actually, that's changed quite a bit now. It used to be you're welcome to your view, I got my view. Now it's not, you're no longer welcome to your own view anymore. Now the cultural pressures are you have to adopt our view. So truly it's one group forcing their morality on others. If you don't adopt it, you have to at least act like you adopt it. But that's a little bit of a separate issue. Let's not overcomplicate things. In relativistic morality, if you think it's okay to have premarital sex, that's true or right for you. And if someone doesn't, then it's true or right for them. And they're on, in a certain sense, separate islands of morality. Different people have their own moral points of view, and that's all you can say about it. And by the way, the space between those islands of morality is called tolerance. So we let the other person have their view, and we don't bug them about that, and we have our view. And this is why people will say, with regards to morality, who are you to tell me what's right or wrong? Or who are you to say? Or why are you pushing your morality on me? This kind of language is reflecting an internal sense, or at least an awareness, or at least what turns out to be a fairly shallow conviction, that morality is not the kind of thing that applies to other people, it's just individual. Now, I think human beings deeply down are common sense moral realists, and I'll talk about that more at the end, but let's just take this at face value. This is what we're confronting, moral relativism. Now, moral objectivism is just on the other side. Okay? Objectivism is the view that morality is not just something you feel and it's up to the individual, but there is an objective state of affairs. There is an objective morality that hangs over everybody. And it's true whether somebody believes it or not. This is why we talked about last night. I talked about abortion. Is that an insulin, or abortion is wrong? Is that insulin or ice cream? Well, that's a claim about the real world, whether in fact abortion is right or wrong. It's an insulin kind of claim. There may be disagreements about whether that's an accurate statement or not, but it's an insulin kind of claim. I'm saying that because I'm an objectivist. Moral relativists, they're not going to say that's an insulin kind of claim. They're going to say it's an ice cream kind of claim, along with all the sexual issues and a whole bunch of other things, by the way. So I'm just now making the distinctions here between moral relativism, moral subjectivism, and moral objectivism. All right. And just to offer a clarification, because there's a lot of confusion about this, and I'm sympathetic to confusion on this issue. And I think there's confusion because there's so much rhetorical stuff going on in the air to confuse people, and there's a lot of cultural pressure to push you in a certain direction in your understanding of these things. So I want to make another distinction here before I move on with a critique. All right? And the other distinction is, I've already made the point that subjectivism or moral relativism is mind-dependent and objectivism is mind-independent. Okay? What this means is that every truth claim is always dependent on the circumstances. Okay? So let me ask you this. Is it true? This is not a trick question, so it's easy to answer. I'm just letting you know in advance. Is it true that Greg Koukl is speaking in front of you right now? Yes. Okay. Will that be true in an hour and a half? No. Why won't that statement be true in an hour and a half? Because the circumstance changes. Truth is when your claim matches the circumstance. When the circumstance changes, then the truth claim has to change with the circumstance. You with me on that? Okay, now this is how it applies to morality, and this is where lots of people get really confused. And this is unfortunate, the way sometimes people have defined objective truth, which they sometimes call absolute truth, and I think that confuses matters, all right? And what they'll say is truth is something that's true for all people at all times and all places. But we just said that it's true that Greg Koukl is speaking right now, but it will not be true at all times. It won't be true in an hour and a half because the circumstances change. You're with me on that so far, right? There's very obvious application, but it has the same application is in play regarding morality. When the circumstances change, sometimes the moral truth regarding those circumstances change. I'll give you a very good example. Is it wrong to punch somebody in the face? And some of you are likely to respond, yes, that's naughty, you know. Wait a minute, doesn't it depend? If I walked up to you and just punched you in the face right now, that probably wouldn't be very nice. But what if I was trying to defend you from hurting a child and I punch you in the face? Would that be wrong then? Probably not. That would be different, wouldn't it? Why is it different? Why is it in some cases it's wrong to punch somebody in the face, but in other cases it's okay to? Because the circumstances change. So moral truth is always dependent on the circumstances, just like any other truth claim. Here's the problem. When I teach this and say this, and this is standard ethical thinking. By the way, this is why you have things like moral dilemmas. And why you have to work through. What's the right thing to do in this circumstance? But when I talk like this, I have been actually called a moral relativist. There's a kind of a fairly well-known talk show host, I can't remember his name, so I can't diss him for you. I wouldn't anyway. But he said publicly, when is Mr. Koukl going to repent from his relativism? Now, I wrote a book on relativism. I know what relativism is. I got an MA in philosophy of ethics. He doesn't know what relativism is, but this is part of the confusion. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the confusion, so I want to make this clear to you. When the circumstances change, the moral rules that apply to the circumstances change. But here is why that's objectivist. If it is wrong for me to do a certain action in that set of circumstances, it's wrong for everybody in that same set of circumstances. There is an objective state of circumstances that an objective rule applies to. And it doesn't matter who the subject is, the same rule applies to them in that circumstance. That's the objective set. That's not the same as relativism. Relativism is when the circumstances are the same for everybody, but everybody has a different moral opinion about it and they do whatever they want. Again, relativism is subject dependent. And objectivism is object dependent. Relativism is mind independent. Objectivism is mind dependent. Okay, with that clarification, now that I've cleared up that confusion, right? It is a tough challenge. Let's talk a little bit about the problems with moral relativism proper. What I'd like to do with the rest of our time together is I want to expose the myth of moral neutrality. The suggestion that morality is just up to everybody. We're all neutral with regards to others. Tolerance is our kind of guiding principle in that. I want to show that the myth of moral neutrality, there is no such thing. And therefore, if tolerance is based on moral neutrality, and neutrality is a myth, then tolerance, the way it's being exercised in our culture, is also a myth. I want to show you how to answer the charge of intolerance kind of in a tactical way in a conversation. And then I'm going to give you some arguments against relativism. Moral relativism is false, and there are very good reasons to believe it's false. There are objective moral principles that apply to everybody. And then I'm going to show you, I'll close with, how does this all fit in with Jesus? Because it's very closely related. And incidentally, if you think about it, if moral relativism is true, this is really bad news for Christianity. Because in Christianity, we believe in Jesus. Jesus is our what? Starts with an S. Savior, right. Okay, he saves us from something, right? Also starts with an S. Sin, right? What is sin? Sin is when you violate an objective moral principle. You do bad. But what if there are no objective moral principles? Well, then there can't be any sin. And if there's no sin, then there's no need for a Savior. And if there's no need for a Savior, there's no need for Jesus. At least not the kind of Jesus we're talking about. Not the insulin kind of Jesus. You can have your ice cream kind of Jesus, fine. But our Jesus is dead in the water, if moral relativism is true. Okay. Now, sometimes relativism can be expressed in fairly sophisticated ways. So I'm going to read something to you that was written by Faye Waddleton. Some of you might remember the name. She used to be the president of Planned Parenthood. Now, you might imagine that I would disagree with her on a lot of things, which is true. But I'm reading this not to ridicule at all, because she's written a piece on moral relativism that I think is very, very compelling, at least at first glance. She's very articulate and very persuasive. In fact, when I read this to you, many of you are going to think, wow, that's pretty persuasive. I'm supposed to probably disagree with her, but I don't know how I can disagree with her without sounding foolish, all right? But there's a flaw here, and we'll talk about that, and you might catch on to it as I read. So here I go. Faye Waddleton. Like most parents, I think that a sense of moral responsibility is one of the greatest gifts I can give my child. But teaching morality doesn't mean imposing my moral values on others. It means sharing wisdom, giving reasons for believing as I do, and then trusting others to think and judge for themselves. My parents' morals were deeply rooted in religious conviction, but tempered by tolerance. There's our word. The essence of which is respect for other people's views. They taught me that reasonable people may differ on moral issues, and that fundamental respect for others is morality of the highest order. I devoted my career to ensuring a world in which my daughter Felicia can inherit that legacy. I hope the tolerance and respect I show her as a parent is reinforced by the work she sees me doing every day, fighting for the right of all individuals to make their own moral decisions about childbearing. Of course, we're talking there about abortion on demand. She continues, 75 years ago, Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood to liberate individuals from the mighty engines of repression. As she wrote, the men and women of America are demanding that they be allowed to mold their lives not at the arbitrary command of church or state, but as their conscience and judgment may dictate. Then she closes. I'm proud to continue that struggle to defend the rights of all people to their own beliefs. When others try to inflict their views on me, my daughters, or anyone else, that's not morality. That's tyranny. It's unfair, and it's un-American. Close quote. Wow, that's good writing. That's powerful. It sounds so sensible. It sounds so reasonable. It sounds so tolerant. But there's a flaw. Before I get to the flaw, though, let me ask you a question. If you followed her rationale, I want to know what her view of morality is. Is her view of it's actually a little bit confused in here, but what it sounds like, is this an ice cream view of morality, or is this an insulin view of morality? Ice cream, yeah. In other words, she says we should trust others to think and judge for themselves. They should be allowed to mold their lives as their conscience and their judgment may dictate. So Waddleton here is relativistic. She's promoting a moral neutrality and non-interference, all right? However, what's the flaw? She says if we're not neutral, we're not tolerant. What's the flaw here? Here's the flaw. Faye Waddleton's not neutral. Does she have the same morally neutral, non-interfering respect for views that differ from hers? Well, let's look at what she says. She says that we should, and by the way, when you hear the word should, it's almost always referring to a moral rule that's being applied to other people. We should respect another's point of view. She wants to continue the struggle to defend the rights of all people to their own beliefs. And then she has this to say of those whose beliefs on morality are different than hers. They're unfair, they're un-American, and they're tyrannous. Do you realize those are all moral judgments that she's making on people who don't agree with her, okay? Here's another curiosity. The first sentence, like most parents, I think that a sense of moral responsibility is one of the greatest gifts I can give my child. And then she goes on to say, this is what she teaches Felicia, her daughter. Now, I just wonder, does she have bedtimes for her kids? Does she make them do their homework? Does she teach them that they ought to respect other people's points of view? What is she doing? As a good parent, she's investing objective moral principles into the life of her daughter. So there's an internal contradiction that's going on at every level of this piece. And not only will she impose her view on her child, she will impose her own moral view on you. How do I know that? Because that's what she said. I've devoted my life to ensuring a world in which my daughter can inherit that legacy. What legacy? Her point of view. And how does she ensure that? She's a lobbyist, for goodness sake. She's not far from us right now. Well, this is where she used to work. I don't know what she's doing now. Capitol Hill, lobbying senators, congressmen, so that they will pass laws that force you to live consistently with her moral point of view, not with your own. Case in point, a while back, Congress passed a law making it a federal offense to block an abortion clinic. And I was driving in the Los Angeles area on the way to an event when I listened to the news, and I had heard Pamela Moraldo, who followed Faye Waddleton as president of Planned Parenthood, and she responded regarding that law with this statement. This law goes to show that no one can force their viewpoint on someone else. You all chuckle because you see the obvious contradiction. All laws force a viewpoint. That's the point of laws. Now, just a clarification. Do I object to Faye Waddleton, Pamela Moraldo, or anyone inveighing as they're able to on Congress to pass laws that reflect their moral viewpoint? No, of course not. That's the American way. Everybody gets a voice, everybody gets a vote. Once in a while, some people get two. But the point is, we get to do what we can in our culture to have our moral viewpoint expressed in law. Nothing wrong with that. My point is very simple. It's not neutral. It's not neutral. Faye Waddleton speaks relativism, but she is not a relativist. She sounds like she's tolerant, but she's willing to force her view on other people. I just want you to get that. That's the myth of moral neutrality. And by the way, if tolerance is, in a sense, the virtue of moral relativism, can't we all just get along? You have your views, I have mine, and we tolerate each other. Then if tolerance is based on neutrality, and there is no neutrality, then tolerance is a myth as well, at least the way it's communicated in this environment. For example, and here I'm going to give you, I'll show you how this kind of works a little bit, but also give you a tool that will help you deal with the issue. This is a tactical maneuver, and it's going to use some questions. I wrote a book called Tactics, a game plan for discussing your religious convictions. And I've found that the best way to engage productively in a hostile environment is to use questions. I call it the Columbo tactic. Lieutenant Columbo, some of you gray heads out there might remember who this guy is, but he would just kind of enter a conversation kind of casually and ask a lot of questions. He's a detective and he's trying to solve the crime, but he comes in under the radar, okay? So this is a way you can do it, but one of the ways we use tactics, questions, is to gather some information, but that also helps us to exploit and reveal a weakness or a flaw in the approach, and you'll see that here. Now we're talking about tolerance. So somebody's going to, because of the things I believe and the way I talk about them, both moral and spiritual, I'm going to be accused of intolerance. This happened lots of times. You're intolerant. When anybody ever calls you a name, always ask for a definition. Whether they call you a homophobe or Islamophobe or a bigot or whatever it happens to be, just ask them what they mean by that. And so if somebody says, you're intolerant, I'm going to ask them, what do you mean I'm intolerant? Why would you say that about me? Well, you think you're right and everyone else is wrong. Okay, notice that's the violation of tolerance, right? I'm the right one, everybody else is wrong. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that when I think I'm right, do you think that when I give an opinion about something, do you think that I think I'm right? Of course. Nobody gives an opinion about something if they don't think their opinion is true, right? Everybody believes their beliefs are true. Now, everybody doesn't know their beliefs are true. That's a different level. But they think they are. That's why we believe what we believe. If we didn't believe our beliefs were true, we wouldn't believe them. We'd believe something else and think that were true. Okay, you with me on that? Which means Mr. Koukl is not the only one in this conversation that thinks he's right. It's just Mr. Koukl is the only one who's getting called a name, whose character is in question for thinking he's right. So now you see that, and I see that, and I realize that. So I could just point that out to him. That would be accurate but inelegant. So instead, I'm going to do what? What do you think I'm going to do? Ask a question, exactly. I ask him, what does he mean by intolerant? And he gives me the definition. You think you're right. Well, I could tell him I do think I'm right, but I mean, I could be wrong, and I'm totally open to that and talking about it, okay? Except for with my kids. But I ask him, what about your own views? Do you think you're right? What's he going to say? No, I think all my views are wrong. Of course he thinks he's right. Now, sometimes they'll do the little postmodern two-step and they'll say, well, I think my views are true for me. Well, if they're just true for you, then why are you talking to me right now? Sounds like you're trying to correct me. You want me to believe like you, which is the tolerant kind. No, they think they're right. Don't let them get away with that, okay? Then I have a final question. Why is it when I think I'm right, I'm intolerant, but when you think you're right, you're just right? What am I missing? Now it's their turn to talk, right? The ball's in their court. And what are they going to say? As God is my witness, 2 times I've had people, when I've asked them, why is it when I think I'm right, I'm intolerant, when you think you're right, you're just right? And they've said to me, because I'm actually right. What's going on here is just raw name calling. They have changed the subject. We're talking about an issue, and they go and call me a name. So we move from the issue to the name calling, right? They've changed the subject. Sometimes I'll ask them, why'd you change the subject? Huh? What do you mean? Well, we were talking about this, and now we're talking about my character. This actually happened on a TV show. Now, I'll talk about the whole show and what took place there at my own breakout coming later this afternoon, which is a subtle advertisement for my session. Okay? But they're doing exactly the same thing that I'm doing, but I'm getting called the name. They've changed the topic. What if I would respond to them when he said to me, well, you're intolerant, and I said, well, you're ugly. And your mom dresses you funny. I wouldn't say that, right? Why not? Because it's rude and it's irrelevant. Can ugly people be right once in a while? Don't you hope so, right? Okay, so it has nothing to do with whether you're right or wrong. And that's what I want people to see. I'm not trying to one-up them. I'm not trying to gotcha. I'm just trying to help them to see, look we're wasting our time here calling each other names. Why don't we spend our time doing the important thing, and that's talking about the issue itself? But I want you to see that in this example, it shows that there is no neutral ground. Everybody who has an opinion about anything is taking a side, even in morality. I'll give you a kind of a little bit of an outdated example, but it doesn't make the point well. When my younger brother raised his kids in Hawaii, he lived there for like 20 years or something in Maui. And his kids went to school, and they were being taught values clarification. You remember that stuff? They don't call this a course anymore, a class. This is the air they breathe now. Values clarification was an exercise in the public schools where kids get to clarify their own values about things. And the particular illustration that they used was there was a husband and wife, and the wife was sick and really in a lot of pain and misery. And the question was, can the husband take the wife's life to ease her suffering? Okay, now it's a very manipulative question. It's the kind of thing that's really difficult for adults to answer. Yet this is what the grade school kids had to answer, okay? And of course, what they're trying to do with these hard, challenging ethical dilemmas is to try to give the impression that all moral choices are like this. They're just up in the air. And what the teacher said is, we are going to let you clarify your own values. I'm not going to tell you what the right answer is. That's up to you. My brother got really angry. He went and talked to the teacher. And the teacher was defensive. The teacher said, look I'm neutral. I'm not telling them what to believe. And my brother pointed out, when you give my children difficult ethical challenges like that, or any, and then you tell them with regards to the right and the wrong answer, it's up to you, that's not neutral. That's moral relativism. By the way, do they do the same thing in math class? I know they do it nowadays, but then... No, they don't do that anymore. They didn't do that then, rather. But morality is up to them. And as a result, many people today live in a moral contradiction. Because I mentioned yesterday, and I got this from Francis Schaeffer, and it's a tremendous help to me. If you see the tactics book, there's a tactic called Inside Out. And the basics for the tactic is that, as Francis Schaeffer says, we live in God's world as a matter of fact, and we are made in the image of God as a matter of fact. And that means there are things that are built into all of us that we cannot get away with. The last line in that chapter says, we can run from God, but we can't run from ourselves. God has built something in there, and that one of the things is a little moral machine that's always running. This is why we can't keep from making moral assessments. Francis Schaeffer called it moral motions. It's part of the human nature that we have. Animals don't have this, okay? C.S. Lewis talked about the content of that. Every society, in no society is cowardice considered appropriate, for example. There does seem to be a standard in all society that's part of human nature. So even though people, as I mentioned earlier, might talk about relativism for themselves, they still are down deep moral realists, the objectivists, if you will, okay? And for me, before I was a Christian in the early 70s, I was a moral relativist. Now, when you're 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, okay, this is really convenient, especially if you're a guy, when, the hormones are flowing and all that other stuff is happening. The last thing you want is religion messing things up, or morality, for goodness sake. I left it all behind and now I was the master of my own fate. However, I was also campaigning against the war in Vietnam. Remember that thing? Wait a minute. Why was I against the war? Because that's an immoral war. You see the contradiction. This happens all the time. What was interesting in my case is I was aware of the contradiction. I was aware that on the one hand, for me, I was embracing moral relativism. On the other hand, for the culture, I was an objectivist regarding the war. And I knew there was a contradiction. But I didn't care. I figured, oh, well, so what? Because the payoff for me was my own liberty. And this is the kind of thing that you see in this culture all the time. When it's convenient for people, for them individually, they're moral relativists. But they do not want other people to be relativists regarding them. I've had people say, I think the culture's changing. What do you mean? Well, they used to be all relativistic, and now they're concerned about things like racism and bigotry and that kind of, and the environment and all they talk like objectivists. So I think they're shifting to objectivism. And my point is, they were never relativists deep down anyway. And we're going to trade on that when we make application to these notions in conversation in just a minute. They were always objectivists deep down, and they've always been relativists on top when it suited them. Okay, they never wanted to be consistent, even today. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to show you why relativism is false. And I know it seems like, how can you do that? I mean, you can do things with science and everything because you got experimental repeatability or observation or those kinds of things that gives you knowledge of a certain type, empirical knowledge that, wow, we can depend on that stuff. Well, by the way, if you know anything about the history of science, scientists have been doing their empirical study, and I'm not dissing science at all, obviously. But they've changed their mind on a whole bunch of things, right? Because the evidence that is available to them changes as well, so they change their opinion about stuff. So it isn't like everything in science has been cast in concrete. It depends on the level of justification that's available to them, okay? Just want to put that in its proper perspective here. But just because you can't examine things like morality empirically does not mean that you can't examine it and come to accurate conclusions about it. In order to do science, we have to have our sense perception intact and giving us reasonably accurate information about the world, right? That's not happening. So we have sense capabilities that tell us about the nature of the world. Guess what? There's not just 5 senses. There's more than 5 senses. If I said that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, therefore what? Socrates is mortal. Wait a minute. How does everybody get the right answer? I learned that in philosophy class. No, you didn't. You didn't have to take any class to know that. Now watch the language here. Can't you just see that if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal? Because the conclusion follows from the premises. You have an intuition that is an insight here. And when I say intuition, I don't mean like female intuition, though I believe in that, ladies. Or something like you've been in a business for a long time and you're really good at it, and so bang, those are all learned things, okay? The professional intuitions. What I'm talking about is what philosophers talk about. It's something that's built inside, something that you didn't learn. It's part of the mechanics machinery of the soul, so to speak. It's an ability. In fact, if you didn't have these kind of intuitions that allow you to learn other things, you couldn't learn anything. You couldn't know anything. There are tools that are right there being made in the image of God that we are constantly using. And this is why we use language like, can't you see that B follows from A, or something like that. If I said that Mary is shorter than John and John is shorter than Bill, what would I know about Mary to Bill? Mary is shorter than Bill. I think that's the transitive property. But the point is, I helped out a little bit. But you could have figured that out just by reflection. Okay, so those are rational intuitions. And incidentally, if I told you, like the Mary thing or the other syllogism that I offered as all men are mortal and all that, and that therefore Socrates is a man or whatever, you went, I don't see that. I said, what do you mean you don't see that? Let me start over. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore what? I don't know. Now, if they couldn't get it, you're not going to be able to prove it to them because that is it. That's it, your ground level. And if they don't get it, guess what? You're going to think something's wrong with them, that they can't put that together, that simple thing, and there would be something wrong with them. So what I've been talking about is rational intuitions that we are all familiar with. And there are sound and healthy intuitions, and in principle, there are times when that's just not working right, and we know it's not working right. What I'm trying to help you to see is that we can have confidence that we can know things that are not delivered to us by science. Science is one way of knowing, but there are other ways of knowing too. Okay, in fact, if you could know things in other ways, science wouldn't work at all. These other things are prior to science, and science relies on them, all right? So we have rational intuitions, what I was just explaining to you. We also have aesthetic intuitions. Beauty is not just simply in the eye of the beholder. And we also have moral intuitions. I think I referred to them earlier as moral common sense. Frankly, if that gal in the chiropractor's office would have been wakened in the middle of the night by screams of the child next door, who had been tormented by the parents because they were enjoying that, she would have immediately realized how wrong that was and would have probably dialed up 911, which just shows us when we're not defending turf philosophically, but we're allowed to let our native capabilities inform the circumstances, much of the time we get the correct answer. And I'm going to trade on moral intuition now to give my critique against moral relativism. And here I'm just going to make some observations. And I want to say one other thing. In this regard, when you're dealing with intuitions in the way that I'm describing them, the burden of proof is not on me, okay? I'm just going to point at things. And if somebody doesn't get it, like for example, if I say torturing babies for fun is wrong, and they say, I don't think so, I'm not going to say, well, you have an interesting alternate moral point of view. I'm going to say, get help. Because something's not working properly if that's the conclusion that you actually come to regarding that behavior. So I'm going to call these the fatal flaws of relativism, and I wrote a book on relativism called, what do you think? Relativism. There you go. It's easy to remember. I don't know if it's here or not, but you can still get it on Amazon. The point is, in that book, I have 7 different fatal flaws of relativism. I'm only going to give you 3 or 4 right here because of my time. But I want you to notice, though, something. In every case, I'm going to be doing kind of the same thing. I mentioned yesterday that words refer. And so when you're speaking subjectively and making statements about flavors of ice cream, you're really referring to yourself. When you're talking about medicine, you're referring to something else, okay? If moral relativism is true, then every time we make a moral statement, we are just referring to ourselves. We're not talking about something out there. When I say rape is wrong, if I'm a relativist, I am not talking about rape. I am talking about me and my feelings and tastes and preferences. You with me on that? Okay? But it turns out there's a whole bunch of things that we talk about somewhat reflexively. Like we're not thinking about it, we just come out with it. And we end up pointing at things using moral language. If it turns out that relativism is true, all of these things that we are saying that is using moral language turns out to be meaningless. We're not talking about these things at all if relativism is true. We're just talking about ourselves. And that's going to turn out to be nonsense. So each one of these things is similar to that. It trades on that same notion. So let's go with the first one. First flaw, if relativism is true, moral relativism is true, then you can never legitimately accuse somebody of doing something wrong. Because that would be kind of like saying you broke a rule in a game that has no rules. Hey, it's a nice fall day outside. Let's go get the football. Let's toss it around. Are we going to play a game? No, there's no game. There's no rules or anything. We're just going to toss it around. Okay, fine with me. And then after one pass, somebody says, out of bounds, illegal, forward movement or something like that. You say, wait a minute. How can I be out of bounds? There's no boundaries. Okay? How many know what the Autobahn is in Germany? Do you ever drive on that? How many ever drove on it? Oh, I did too, in a rental car. Can you break the speed limit on the Autobahn? No, why not? No speed limit, unless you're a commercial vehicle. No speed limit, you go as fast as you want. That's crazy. I got up to about 120 and I thought, oh man, I gotta slow down. Then when I slowed down to 60, the other guy that's going 120 could have hit me going 60 miles an hour, like I was standing still. It's crazy. Okay, you cannot break a law that doesn't exist. If relativism is true, there are no moral laws that exist over everybody. Therefore, no one could ever do anything that's really wrong. All they could ever do is something you don't like. But why should I care if you like it or not, if relativism is true? Right? Because you can't smuggle in the obligation, I should be kind to you and be sensitive to what you like. You can't do that because now you're assuming a moral good that applies to everybody, and I ought to act that way towards you. So here's the first flaw. There can't be anything that's wrong. Now you just have to ask yourself, maybe not everything some people think, especially religious people think is wrong, is actually wrong, but aren't there some things that are actually wrong? If there's even one thing that is really wrong objectively, mind independently, it's not dependent on my belief, then relativism is false. By the way, I think of objectivism like this. Objectivism like gravity, right? If you don't believe in gravity, you're not going to float away because gravity is an objective feature of the world, which brings up something else that you said yesterday. If there's no gravity in heaven, how are we going to talk to each other? We're all floating all around everywhere. I never heard that before. I got to think about that. Okay, here's the second flaw. Relativists, watch this. Relativists cannot complain about the problem of evil. How is the problem of evil usually characterized? Okay? How could there be a God when there's so much evil, watch this, in the world? In the world. People correctly observe that there are bad things that happen that shouldn't happen. That's not the way it's supposed to be. But wait a minute, if there is no way for it's supposed to be, that it's supposed to be relativism, then there can't be a way there's not supposed to be. Maybe I said that too fast. There's got to be moral rules for moral rules to be broken, objective rules, for there to be a problem of evil. If there is no objective morality, there are no broken speed limits. Therefore, there can't be any. Look at all those speeders in the Autobahn. If what you mean by speeding is breaking the law, there are no speeders in the Autobahn because there's no law. If there's no law, there can't be any breaking of the law. If moral relativism is true, there cannot be a problem of evil. It's kind of like somebody saying, I can't believe in God. Why not? Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts? Yeah, did you ever taste those things? They're disgusting. Well, I happen to agree with that, although I've noticed that more and more it's showing up on menus as appetite. Brussels sprouts? What are you trying to chase people away? What's up with that? In any event, I can't believe in a God who would make something so distasteful to me personally. Well, that's a silly argument against God. But that is the argument against God based on evil in the world if relativism is true. There are things that happen that I don't like. Well, why should anybody care? Especially if relativism is true, as you say it is. So there can't be any problem of evil. If there is evil in the world, there's got to be objective morality. Relativists can't demand justice or fairness. Why not? Because justice and fairness are virtues. They're things you ought to do. All right? And also they kind of trade on the notion, justice especially, that there are some people that are guilty and some people that are innocent. But if there's no morality, there is no guilt, there is no innocence, so justice doesn't even apply to them. But boy, isn't this a big deal right now, social justice? Well, how can you have an obligation of justice when morals are relative? Do you notice, and I'm not going to go through the rest of it, I'm getting close to out of time, and I have a close that I want to offer you here. But all of these are the same kind of thing. There are different ways that people in our culture are pointing at things that are moral goods that they are taking as if they're objective, yet in their language and proclamations, they seem to be relativist. You can't have it both ways. And this is why people don't want others to be relativist towards us. And it's also why we don't teach this to our kids. But if relativism is true, there's nothing wrong. There's no evil. There's no good either, by the way. Everything's lost at a twilight of moral nothingness. So I want to very quickly offer you a couple of tactics, a couple of maneuvers, okay? The way to deal with relativists is ask them questions about their statements. So when somebody says, "Don't push your morality on me," okay, you ask a question. Why not? Why not? Or they say something like, then what are they going to say in response to that? Why not? Because it's wrong? No, they can't say that. They just told you that's not the way it works, right? Okay, so they're kind of stuck there. Notice that when they say, "Don't push your morality on me," they are assuming a moral good while they're denying moral goods. There's a conflict there, okay? I'll give you an example of this happened in the same chiropractor's office, okay? And a young man prepping me, he was the PT, the physical therapist. And so we're talking about spiritual things, we have a conversation. The issue of homosexuality came up. He asked my opinion. I gave him my opinion. And he said, you Christians are, we're having a friendly conversation. And you Christians are nice people, but pretty soon you start getting judgmental. Okay, now, some of you know already, I can see your heads nodding, that he just made a mistake. Many of you haven't seen this yet, but after this morning, you will not miss it when it happens. Because I asked him then another question just to clarify, what's wrong with that? And then he said, it's wrong to judge. Now he's given me a moral rule, right? What's the problem with the statement? When he says it's wrong to judge and he is upbraiding me from my point of view, he is doing what? He's judging me. So I said, Gil, question again, if it's wrong to judge, then why are you judging me right now? Now, Gil had never heard anything like that before. And he steps back a little bit, he's scratching his chin, and he's trying to figure out what just happened, okay? And finally, he says, well, okay, maybe it's okay to judge. That's what he said. But you can't push your morality on other people. Once you've done that, you cross the line. So I had another question, clarification. Gil, is that your morality, what you just told me? And he said, yes, it is, blithely, like he didn't realize. He thought it improved his circumstance. So I had another question. I said, then why are you what? Pushing your morality on me right now. And he's back here again, scratching his chin. He makes a couple of other false starts. He can't get going, obviously, because it's a self-refuting. And finally he says, it's not fair. I said, what do you mean it's not fair? He said, I can't find a way to make it, say it that it sounds right. I said, Gil, it doesn't sound right because you're doing the very thing you're telling me not to do. That's why it doesn't. It's not a word trick. Sometimes I had people say to me at this point in the conversation, now you got me all confused, like that. I said, no, you were confused when you started. Just now figured that out. Now I'm really tight on time here, so I want to cut to the close. You see how this works. I could spend more time giving more illustrations. The key here is to keep in mind that nobody is really a relativist. Deep down inside, they're human beings made in the image of God, and their moral objectivism is going to come out all the time. And you begin asking questions about what they just said. Oh, I thought you were an atheist. I thought you were a relativist. You're complaining about the God of the Bible being immoral. Where are you getting the moral standard to judge God by? I'm curious. It really confuses me. And see what they say. By the way, there is no answer to that. There's no meaningful answer to that, all right? Because the evolutionary answer to morality is another kind of relativism, because it's the evolutionary point of view that we have that's inside of us, produced by evolution, allegedly. It's mind-dependent. Biology can't make rape wrong or anything else wrong. That will not work when you're talking about real objective morality, which is what people are talking about. Okay. A number of years ago, I lectured at Berkeley, Cal. And I was talking about this issue, and I was giving this talk. And then at the end, I said, there's something that I know. Look, if relativism is false, then some form of moral objectivism is true, right? It's either or. There's no middle ground in this one. Law of excluded middle, all right? So some form of moral objectivism, there are laws of some sort that apply to everybody. Here's the problem. Not only are there laws, but we didn't keep them, and we know it. And I told the audience, there's something that we all feel when we look down inside of us and we are thinking about morality, and we have an awareness and subjective awareness, a feeling about the fact that we don't keep the laws that we ought to keep. We have a word to describe that. What is that word? Guilt, exactly. That's what they said. I just waited for the audience. This is Cal, for goodness sake. It was an overflow. The whole audience thing was filled, and they were in overflow rooms with TVs. But I could hear it all over the audience. Guilt, guilt, guilt. I said, yeah, why do we feel guilty? There's a question for you. Why do we feel guilty? Oh, maybe culture causes that. You could knock that one around. But how about this? Let me suggest this. Maybe, I don't know, maybe we feel guilty because we are guilty. Maybe we feel guilty because we are guilty. Is that in the running? Okay, well, that certainly makes sense of the discovery that we had that evening, that morality is objective and not merely subjective. And then I said, the answer to guilt is not denial. That's relativism. That's just sophisticated denial. The answer to guilt, I said, is forgiveness. And this is where Jesus comes in. That's what I said. That was the first time all night long I had mentioned anything about Jesus or anything religious. I was giving a philosophic discussion on philosophic issue, the nature of morality. But this is where it all cashes out. And this is kind of the way I started. If there is no objective morality, there is no sin, there's no need for a savior, but we know morality is objective, and therefore we know that we haven't kept that and we have sin, and therefore deep down inside we know we need rescuing by a savior. This is the heart of it. The good news is not good news without the bad news. And the worse the bad news is, the better the good news is, and the bad news is really bad. And I'm concerned that this is something we've left out of the equation in evangelism. Just saying here, I got 1 minute and 58 seconds. I looked in the New Testament, the book of Acts, and I looked up every single case the gospel is preached. You can do it yourself, or if you're really lazy, you can go on our website and say the preaching of love in the book of Acts. So I did a piece on this, just summarized everything. There is no preaching of love in the book of Acts. There is no preaching of the love of God anywhere in the book of Acts. The word love doesn't appear in the entire book. Now, is the love of God manifest there? Yeah, sure it is. It's manifest in the forgiveness that's offered for people who are really in trouble. And incidentally, these people preaching in the book of Acts are the people Jesus trained personally. Now, you can do whatever you want with that theologically, but that's just the fact of the text. And if all we're doing is talking about the love of God, and we are not telling us that the love of God is first manifest in an offer of forgiveness that is absolutely necessary before you can ever experience anything meaningful about the love of God in relationship, then we are not giving the message. Because the good news is not good news without the bad news. The fact is, there is morality. The other fact is we break it all the time, which is why we all desperately need a Savior every single day. And that Jesus is there constantly making intercession for us because Jesus is the only one who solved the problem. Lord Jesus, thank you so much. It will never be the case on this side of the grave that I think any of us will really have but a smidgen of understanding of what you have provided for us, what you have made available to us, how you have rescued us. But with what we know, we just say thank you for that. And we pray that you would help us graciously and accurately make this message known to the world, even in spite of all of the incredible pushback that we're facing now. Help us to stand tall and to be faithful for Christ's sake. Amen.